When you're sewing, how do you clip curves? And why do you clip curves? Today we're talking about one of those small techniques that can make such a difference in how your finished garment looks. And that's how to clip or notch your curved seams. If you've ever sewed an armhole or a neckline and it looks kind of puckered and won't sit flat, this is probably why. So let's fix that. I'll also help you learn how not to overthink it when you can't remember if you're supposed to clip or notch. There are two types of curves you'll encounter when sewing: inner curves and outer curves. If you're making garments, inner curves are the main thing you'll sew. Think the curve of a neckline or an armhole or a crotch curve. They all curve inward like a valley. But occasionally you might encounter an outer curve. Think like a Peter Pan collar or a scalloped hem like on this top I made years ago. Those curve outward like a hill or the outside of a circle. Inner curves versus outer curves need different treatments, and that's where clipping versus notching comes in. On an inner curve, and pretend the sample is an armhole, once you've sewed that seam, when you turn your seam allowances to the inside of the garment, they would want to pucker and pull like this, and you would never be able to press this into submission to be a nice curve. So to fix that, you need to clip the curve at intervals, like on this sample, to allow the seam allowance to relax and lay flat. The basic concept of clipping a curve is that you're just making room for that fabric at the seam line to relax on the inside of the garment, and the seam can lay flat. And when I turn these seam allowances to the inside, look at how dramatic of a difference it is at that curve. Without any pressing or understitching or anything, I can see that this already looks like a nice curve. To do this, you would typically trim down your seam allowances first, which we can talk about another time, so we're just focusing on clipping today. Just take careful little snips and get close to the seam line, but obviously don't cut through your stitching. Take your time. On a shallower curve like a boat neck, you don't need to clip very often. I just do like every ½ an inch or so along the more curved areas up by the shoulders, but I do still do a few spaced out along the entire neckline. I find it helps with the finished look. And on a tighter curve like our armhole example, I tend to clip as close as ½ an inch or so, depending on how tight that curve is. You can see it just relaxes that tension so those seam allowances can spread open along the curve when they're turned towards the inside of the garment. Honestly, don't overthink it. Just do what feels right and works to relax your fabric. How many clips and how close together really depends on how tight your curve is and your particular fabric. If you turn the seam allowances to the inside and they still won't lay flat, just do another couple clips. But there is one situation when you can skip clipping an inner curve, and that's when you're using bias tape around a curve as a facing or a binding. Bias tape is cut on the bias grain of fabric, meaning it naturally has a lot of stretch and can curve easily. Plus, you're usually applying it with a very narrow seam allowance. So there's no need to bother clipping the curves with bias tape, although if it's a really tight curve, I have been known to put in a clip or two. Now let's look at outer curves and pretend this is 1/2 of a Peter Pan collar. On an outer curve, the seam allowance has more fabric than it needs once the seam allowances are turned towards the inside, so it's going to want to overlap itself on the inside, making things really wrinkly. And look in here, you can see that if you press this, this is going to be super lumpy because there's all that extra fabric from the seam allowances on the inside. So you don't want to just clip into the seam allowances like we did on the inner curve. That relaxes the fabric so that it can spread out on the inside of the garment, but it doesn't get rid of any excess fabric. So instead, you'll actually cut little notches out to get rid of some of that extra fabric in the seam allowances. You just snip out small little triangles about every ½ inch or ½ inch in the really curved areas. Again, this depends on the shape and curve of your piece, so see what works best for you. And then just turn it towards the inside to see if it's flat enough. And if it isn't, just cut another notch or two if you need one, or widen one up a little bit. You can see inside now compared to before, there's not all that extra fabric bunching up and waving along the inside, so the seam allowances will lay nice and flat once this is pressed. There's also a shortcut you can use for some outer curves, and that's these guys. Because pinking shears notch, you can technically use them as a fast way to clip out notches on an outer curve. I don't personally use this method since I like the control of doing them individually, but if you're comfortable with it, it can be a nice quick option. Now what about a princess seam? You technically have an inner curve on one piece that's sewed to an outer curve on another piece. You could get really fussy about this if you wanted to, but here's how I see it. Once these pieces are sewed together, they form an outer curve to curve around the body. An outer curve needs room for those seam allowances on the inside so they don't get all bunched up. So I notched the curve on a princess seam. And the last way to clip a curve is to not do it at all. If you turn your seam allowances to the inside of your garment and things lay flat, don't clip. Your garment will tell you if you need to clip or notch the curve. And you can easily diagnose it if you can't remember when to clip or notch. If you turn your seam allowances to the inside and the seam line looks puckered and tight, clip them so they can relax and spread out. And if your seam allowances look all lumpy on the inside of a curve, notch them so they have room to lay flat. And if your seam is flat without you doing anything, you're good. Of course, there's more fundamentals to think about when sewing curves, like trimming your seam allowances or understitching to set yourself up for a great looking garment. For more sewing fundamentals, check out my basics playlist or watch my video on understitching. And I'd love to know what other fundamental sewing skills you'd like me to cover in this series. Drop me a note in the comments. Be sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss anything, and I'll see you again soon with more vintage sewing.